We're going on with this, starting this series of Faith Runs Deep. So next week, Carl Faze is actually speaking at Clovie Mobbery, so we're going to have him stream in. So we're going to watch on video as he's going to talk to some of why this came about, why he had this series, and why he thought it was important to look and realise that Australia has a rich history of faith that we sometimes have forgotten in this secular environment, that Australia is. And even if we think about how it started, especially for eastern states, it started as convict settlements. Of course, we're so much different and way better, aren't we, Rob? Way better. You know, free settlers and all of that stuff we love to believe in. But even in that space, wherever it started, even with Parliament starting in 1900s, even for our Parliament in the 1830s, God was always acknowledged as part of that. It was part of the story. You able to put up the PowerPoint for us, Paul? Great. So Carl Faze was thinking about wanting us to recognise there's always been a deep and rich history of that in our nation, and that God still calls us to deep places and where faith meets us in those deep places. So often, sometimes we live shallow, and it's when things happen that we don't realise that that's where faith is called in Australia. So it wants to look back at our history and look at some people that have done things and what is it calling us into? What is God calling us into? And this first week is talking about this idea of eternity in our hearts. The fact that it's not working, Paul. Don't know? There. It's good. Starting at this space, that it is God's story. That it is God's story. This whole thing is essentially, and the Bible speaks to that idea of this meta-narrative, that God created the heavens and the world and they're his. Yeah? And he's always been in the process of making things new. Since coming to the world, we know this story, know the brokenness that we've brought into this world, but God's always in the business of making things new. That's what he's about. This is the story that he calls us in. And with that first idea that this is God's, everything's actually God's. But in the spirit of reconciliation, and especially on a day like today, and this week as we're celebrating or thinking about reconciliation, we want to acknowledge that God gave the Gawler people this land, the traditional owners of this land that he was given, and in fact has never been ceded. Their sovereignty has never been ceded, and the Crown sovereignty sits alongside that. That's how we work now today. Yeah. So we want to acknowledge that this is Gawler country. Yeah. That was God's story. And if you hear Aboriginal people in their stories, in their dream time, even though they use all sorts of different metaphors, there's always been room for an understander of a creator. Yep, they sometimes have weird and wonderful ways of how to explain that, but there was always room for the idea that there was a God. And it's amazing how for Aboriginal people, there was an openness straight away when people shared that story of Jesus. That in fact, so many Aboriginal folk became Christians and are Christians. And there's more Aboriginal people in the census that will put up their hand and say they're Christian than they are of other people that aren't Aboriginal. Do you know that? We're under 50% now in the census of everyone else. For Aboriginal people, it's more like 2/3. Yeah? Because it fits the story that they understand. And so there was a depth of their understanding of God that people came about. When people came to tell that story to them, they were ready. It's really interesting. South Australia is unique in other places in other states because it took a while for missionaries to see that idea. But in South Australia, Lutherans that came out on the boats, that was their focus in the 1830s. And it's in fact missionaries then. Don't get me wrong, this is some of the things, sometimes this has been unhelpful in the way that they've related to Aboriginal folk in their own, but it's actually some Lutheran pastors and Lutheran missionaries that sat with Gawler people on the banks of the Torrens and wanted to know their language, who wrote down their language, that is the reason that the Gawler language is not lost today. I don't know if you know that. But the Gawler language, because again, something that we did was stop people speaking their language all around. That's the story actually around of a lot of places. The Aboriginal folk have lost culture and lost their language because they weren't allowed to speak their language. And we did that a little bit here. But because Lutheran missionaries wrote their language down, it's actually re-emerged. It's been able to survive. That's a story of God making all things new again. People not losing their culture of who they are. Yeah? But this is the part that Carl Fays wanted to focus on for us to think about in this space as well. There's a few verses that he wanted to think about. He has made everything beautiful in its time. He's also set eternity in the human heart. Yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. It's a beautiful picture, this idea of, sometimes scholars have used this language of a divine spark. Have you heard that before? That idea that humans have been made uniquely different, that eternity has been set in their hearts, that we know and feel like it should be more than just this. Yeah? That's the pain that we quite often feel, isn't it? That there's more than just this. Yeah? And this is what Ecclesiastes talks about. He set eternity in our hearts. But also that God is unfathomable. He's actually bigger than we can comprehend. He knows beginning to end. That's the depth of who God is. And what God is calling us to. Remember I said that God's making all things new. And we know this. This is Jesus came down and his work on the cross was so that we could be forgiven for the contribution that we've made to the brokenness of this world. Sin. So we can be forgiven and reconciled to the Father. Jesus did that work. He died on the cross so that we may live. Yeah, that's the picture. Baptism picture. Yeah. Death to ourselves, alive in Jesus, so that we can be reconciled, so we can have relationship again with the Father. So we are forgiven. And now it gives us the opportunity to participate in God's kingdom. This kingdom that will have no end. This eternity, the depth of not just this shallow life of what we just see in here, but the depth of God calls us into a kingdom that knows no end. Now, so often we think about that kingdom, heaven, but that kingdom's right now. Jesus came right now and he's wanting to set things new. Not fully, it won't be fully realised till he comes back again. But he asks us to participate in this work. What was Jesus' work? What did we say? Forgiveness and reconciliation. Yep, forgiveness and reconciliation. These are the words. So this week, we want to look at this depth. The depth of the idea of forgiveness and reconciliation. There's a deep work that Jesus has done, but actually he calls us to now. Yeah? That work's done in us, but it hasn't been fully done. Anyone notice? Anyone notice in their own life that there's still necessarily reconciliation needed? Not just Aboriginal people, but in general. And we need, and other people need forgiveness. Yeah? Ephesians 2. If I could read, I'd read that, but I need to get my eyes fixed. But now, in Christ Jesus, you who once were far away have been brought near by the blood of Christ. For he himself is our peace, who has made two groups one, and divided the barrier and the dividing wall of hostility. By setting aside in this flesh the law with its commands and regulations, his purpose was to create in itself one new humanity out of two, thus making peace, and in one body to reconcile both of them to God through the cross, by which he's put to death their hostility. What's he talking about, the two becoming one here? Does anyone know what they're talking about here? It's a bit, That's what he's talking about here, the people who knew God and people who didn't, the people of God and people who not of God, the Jews and then the Gentiles. Yeah? But this is relevant This is the work that God is always doing. This is specifically this, but he's always doing. He's always doing that in our lives individually. Of where there's hostility, God actually wants us to understand that we are one in him. Yet because of the work he's done, we can be one. Yeah. That we can work in that space of reconciliation. Yeah. To actually see ourselves together. Yeah. So what does that mean when we think of, that means, I got lost there for a second, going back to that idea, what is the idea? We participate in that. We participate in making two become one, of being reconciling forgiveness. It looks like being an ambassador. 2 Corinthians talks about this idea of us being ambassadors for Jesus in this world. We are therefore Christ's ambassador, as though God were making his appeal through us. We implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. So what does that look like in Australia? What does that look like? Personally, that might look different in each of your lives. Yeah? That you are agents and ambassadors for reconciliation vertically and horizontally. Yeah, God's kingdom is not just this relationship, but it's our relationship with one another. The way our relationship, because Jesus has changed our relationship with him, it means he gives us to be ambassadors so we can change the relationship here. And so what did that look like for Jews and Gentiles? That they would understand, that they would let go of the hostility that they had. When that was written, we think, when that was written, Romans and Jews were at war. Yeah? And eventually ended up with the temple being destroyed. When that was written, there was fighting, Jewish forces fighting Romans, fighting Nabateans, fighting, and there was a real hostility. Paul was saying, be reconciled to God so that you can be one and reconciled to one another. Don't hold it against each other. So what does that look like in Australia? Well, I think there's still some feelings of hostility sometimes between Aboriginal people and others for the nature of the pain that they had experienced. Yeah, we all know that there had been wrong done to Aboriginal people. Yeah, none of us can't deny that the way that they interacted with European settlement was unhelpful in the smallest of terms, in all sorts of ways. And so it's good for us to be thinking about, just like those Lutheran missionaries thought about the way that they interacted with Aboriginal folk, how do we be agents? How do we be ambassadors? What does that look like? Yeah. I want to show a video just that Carl Fay's put together. He put a little bit of talking with some Aboriginal elders and Aboriginal people of their personal experiences of that. And what does it look like?
To see Aboriginal people struggling today in a community fraught with death, fraught with family violence, drugs, and alcoholism, and the little Christian band tries to keep together. And there, one minister, who I won't name the place or everything else, the year before last took 52 funerals. How do you preach or prepare a Bible study or something like that when your whole year is spent in crisis management, anger management and grief?
My sister in the middle of the day was locked up for drunkenness in the middle of the day in Brewarrina. And if you know anything about deaths in custody, 10 years before there was also a death in custody in 1987, and that community erupted into violence, and my family were involved at the shock of a person dying in police custody in our little town. So 10 years later, I knew what I was presented with, that this couldn't happen again. I just spent all my parts of my life dedicating it to improving relationships and opportunities for Aboriginal people. How can this happen? Not to realise in 1997 my sister would die in the same police cell as the one who did in 1987.
I grew up experiencing a lot of racism, which of course has an enormous impact upon your life. In my secondary school, we were talking about our teacher asked, what did you want to do when you were leaving school? And I said I wanted to, and I was the only Aboriginal student in the class, and I said I wanted to go to university. And her, along with the students, mocked me and laughed at me.
Wow.
And said, you know, black people only work with their hands, that'll never happen. So that spurred me, that stayed in my belly, and it was like a little flame. And it was like, yeah, I'm going to prove you wrong.
In 87 there was a riot. What happened in 97?
We were absolutely presented with the opportunity to do exactly the same thing. I was the eldest brother of four, and in our community, people see me as a leader. People see me as the sort of front runner to many things. They'll consult me on issues. And on this one, I was absolutely consulted about, we would take the police on, burn Brewarrina to the ground, and lots of people would get hurt. That's what I was presented with within a day of my sister passing away. And that's when this story all changed. My life had changed when I was presented with that opportunity, and when we chose the right decision, myself and my dad, everything changed in my life.
You went to Sydney, to Redfern. If we met you then, what would you have been like?
You wouldn't have met me. We wouldn't have crossed on the same side of the street.
Yeah.
And if we did, chances are I'd have been in your face. It makes me laugh now in hindsight. All 3 foot of me, you know, but in my mind I was a black revolutionary, so I wanted the conflict, and I wanted you to know that you were living in a stolen country.
There were many parts of my family who really wanted to disturb the peace, particularly between our local people and the police. I started to formulate a plan that could train and develop Aboriginal young people, particularly to go and work in New South Wales Police, and then come back to our communities to help make that social change, so we could develop our relationship. Well, I can see potential for real jobs for these young people, to give them hope.
You pursued education. What did you do?
I did my theological studies at UTS and Nungalinga. I also went to Sydney University and Flinders University and did theological studies.
Was your mum around when you got your PhD?
Yeah.
What was that like for her?
I was the first Aboriginal to be graduating with a PhD from Sydney University. She was absolutely excited.
Yeah, so we're in East Dubbo, and we're in what they call Apollo Estate. So it's Apollo Estate is a public housing estate. It's predominantly Aboriginal people that live here, and it was one of 3 of our housing estates within the city.
What's the big challenges, say, for young people out here that you're dealing with?
Yeah, so getting out of disadvantage, as it's been for generations. If you live an impoverished life, where do you see opportunities? And the statistics on our young people entering into the justice system is worse now than it's ever been. And so even after all of the investments by different layers of government, we still have such disadvantage. And so if you get a good education, you get the best opportunity to get the best job.
I spent 10 years at least living and working on the main streets of Mount Druitt. Yeah, I met a guy who had an indelible, left an indelible imprint in my life. Father Paul Hannah from the local Catholic parish there. And I just saw that this, for the first time in my life, I met a priest who had a social conscience and who wanted to work with people, and in particular my people, or the people on the margins. And suddenly it was as if I saw for the first time, this is what Jesus is like.
Like some of the stories there, you can look up and have a look at Peter Gibbs, who's a Christian Wurundjeri man, who the story of he tells about his sister's death in custody and him making the choice, him and his father making the choice, I guess within their culture and their understanding that they had the right to be angry at the police and start things up, and that's what their community wanted to do. And they stood up and said, no, we're going to be something different. That we're going to forgive. And that's the place that started him along the journey. He started this organisation to work with the police in Dubbo. They started a new pilot program of Aboriginal folk working alongside police and explaining to them and helping them work in the community to get better outcomes. And because of that, it's been taken all through Sydney now, the iProud program, and given Aboriginal people jobs in that space as well, of helping police to culturally appropriately work in ways with the community. And it's pretty amazing, the work that Peter Gibbs is doing. To me, that's a space and place of what reconciliation looks like. From Peter's point of view, was to go, I need to forgive first. Yeah, the starting place. Reconciliation has those spaces of sometimes we want to put people in the perpetrator or the victim space, and so often that's all amongst the mix of it all. But it requires someone to ask for forgiveness, sometimes forgiveness to be had, but sometimes it doesn't. Yeah. About 6 years ago, actually. Wanted to start with this, which I think is really great, that Aboriginal elders from all around Australia, on the 50th anniversary of the 67 census, the Aboriginal people were to be counted in the census and counted as Australian citizens for the first time. A 50-year anniversary of that was 2017. Aboriginal elders from all around the place came together and met together and wanted to talk about where to from now, what we want to say to our government now, what's the best way to head towards relationship in the best way, recognising where they are. And as that Peter said, he said recognising that actually all this money's been thrown at a problem, that the problem's actually probably got worse. Yeah, money is not the answer to this problem. And they came up with, and again, 3/4 of those Aboriginal folk are actually Christians too. And they came up with, I don't know if you've heard of the Uluru Statement of the Heart. You guys heard of that? Still not working, Paul, if you want to click on for me. This is what I wanted to us to think about. And I don't want to get political because it's not, I think it's your job to think about where God's calling us to. But they came up with essentially three ideas. They talked about the idea of sovereignty is shared. It's really interesting that they were saying, like I'd said before about the idea of sovereignty, acknowledging Crown sovereignty and acknowledging Aboriginal sovereignty. That Aboriginal sovereignty hasn't been ceded legally and it coexists with the Crown sovereignty. That's what they acknowledge and believe, but they want to know and how to work together again because of the issue of the most incarcerated people in the world are Aboriginals. That's in the world, percentage-wise. Yeah? That life expectancy is 20 years younger than for us that aren't Aboriginal. And they said, we wanted to come, can you click through? Oh, there we go. Thanks, mate. Came up with this idea of a Makarrata Commission, which is essentially an agreement after struggle. An agreement after struggle is an Aboriginal word We should think about this agreement, how we agree to work together. We still haven't worked those three things through. It hasn't actually been written down anywhere properly of how we actually have an agreement, a treaty. And they talked about the idea of being able to share story. A lot of places in the world, one of the most amazing stories about South Africa was their reconciliation commissions that was a part of their process that was wonderful, again, Christian-led idea of how after apartheid that came together. And they suggest that we should be able to have that and then figure out, because of those things, figure out how a voice to Parliament. Yeah? You've probably heard recently about the third thing on there, haven't we? We've heard about this idea of voice. It's really interesting, and I don't necessarily want to get political in there, but it's really interesting that many Aboriginal folk want to say no at the moment to Commission because they don't think it's the right place to start. Does that make sense? Yeah, because we haven't figured out how the agreement of how we work together. Yeah, and we haven't figured out, and through that, the voice will make sense. Yeah. So anyway, we can don't always be pushed into the space. People, quite often you'll hear people say no, and it's like, well, it must be because you're racist. But it doesn't make necessarily sense. But what I'm trying to say is the heart here. I love the heart here, which again I think is God's heart. God's heart to how do we work together? How do we love together? How do we recognise that we are one in this nation? That's what was beautiful about the words in the Uluru Statement of the Heart, which I guess was frustrating me personally that our government didn't accept that in 2017. Ignored it. Because they were trying to say, we are Australians together. Let's figure out how we can work this together. Yeah? That's at the heart of what it is to be reconciled. So what does that mean to be Christ's ambassadors? I guess I want to finish with, and I'm going to get the music team up. So I'm going to start. We've talked about Aboriginal folk, we've talked about that reconciliation, that need, and God's kingdom, I think, to be recognised in that place. But for you personally, that will look different. And I want us to just give God time to speak. Not just talking for Aboriginal folk, because I think I'd love you to be more informed and think through that. But I actually want you to take this into your own lives and think about the places where you might need forgiveness or you might need to ask for forgiveness. So let's just give some time to God. Lord God, just thank you for who you are. Thank you that you are a reconciler, that you saw a problem and you gave your son and worked it through. He gave his life for us so that we could be one. And you're asking us all to be reconciled to you so that we can live in the harmony, that we don't live by hostility anymore. And as humans, we make that mistake all the time. Revenge feels right, but those who get revenge so often feel empty because it doesn't help. Only forgiveness and reconciliation heals our hearts, God. And so I'd ask for each of us, a someone or a something might come to our minds when we think of this. A hurt that we have or a hurt that we have done. God, show us how to be reconciled as your ambassadors, God, in that space. God, I think of a couple of relationships for me that aren't fully what they were. And you're calling me to push more into that. Not to just accept that we're okay, rather than as we work, God, help me to be that ambassador, to push into relationship, to reconcile. And I'd ask you give each one here the courage by your Spirit to do what they need to do, to know who it is they need to go to make a relationship whole again. this is your work, this is your kingdom's work.